Hey there, beautiful souls. Thanks for joining me today. You know that feeling when the person who promised to stand by you just doesn't? When the lips that whispered, forever, suddenly fall silent at the moment you need them most? That's where my story begins, with my wife's silence as her sister destroyed what I thought was my career. Little did they know, their betrayal would become the foundation of my greatest triumph. If you've ever had your heart shattered by someone you trusted completely, stay with me. This is my story. Raw, unfiltered, and still painful to tell. I remember the day I left Morgan Stanley like it was yesterday. 8 years of climbing the corporate ladder, building a reputation, earning my place. But when Eliza Harwood smiled at me across that dinner table, her father Douglas beside her saying, "This company needs someone with your vision." Leaving it all behind felt like the easiest decision in the world. Love makes you brave. Or maybe just blind. The first years at Harwood and Vail Innovations were magical. I wasn't just any family business. Since the 80s, they've dominated proprietary microprocessing solutions for electronics and energy. The kind of company where hallways smell like coffee and ambition, where engineers speak a language only they understand. I learned it though, I had to, especially after I fell in love with and married Eliza Harwood. I still remember our wedding day. The way she looked at me, like I was her everything. The way her father Douglas embraced me, not just as a son-in-law, but as the future of his company. "This man has business in his blood," he'd announced to everyone at our reception, his hand heavy on my shoulder. Only Sloane, Eliza's sister, Harvard MBA, with her razor-sharp mind and lethal smile, never accepted me. "Non-Harwoods should stick to supporting roles," she once said during a strategic planning meeting, eyes fixed on me while addressing everyone else. Eliza, caught between husband and sister, wore her diplomatic silence like armor. She'd squeeze my hand under the table but never contradicted her sister openly. I told myself it was family dynamics, complicated, messy, but ultimately harmless. God, I was wrong. When Douglas stepped back with minor health concerns last year, he entrusted what he called the next generation with his legacy. I'd just saved the company millions by securing that Japanese bailout deal in 2021 when global supply chains were fracturing. Douglas called me the company's savior in his eloquent toast at the holiday party. I was riding high, leading our Eastern European expansion, a $47 million deal with a Polish energy firm that would secure our foothold across 6 countries. I worked through Thanksgiving to finalize projections. Everything on paper looked perfect. The company was growing, my marriage seemed solid. The Harwood dynasty was thriving. Then things shifted. Subtly at first. Douglas abruptly cut his main vacation short but didn't come into the office. Meeting invites would change without notifications. Eliza and Sloane suddenly had sister lunches 3 times a week. Key staff who reported directly to me were reassigned overnight. I'd come home late, exhausted from trying to keep our Eastern European deal on track, and find Eliza's side of the bed empty. "Just catching up with Sloane," she'd say, when she finally slipped under the covers, turning away from me without a kiss goodnight. A new distance growing between us, cold and vast as a winter sea. "Something's brewing," Frankie Delgado, our head accountant, told me over a hushed coffee. "Not sure what, but they're planning something. Watch your back." I should have listened more carefully. The email arrived at 8:43 a.m. on a Tuesday. 10 a.m., 20th floor conference room, Eastern Europe project. Simple, normal. A standard meeting notification that gave no hint it would change my life forever. I spent the morning polishing my presentation, rehearsing numbers, envisioning the handshakes that would follow. I walked into that conference room with a leather portfolio filled with financial projections and partnership models, my wedding ring catching the light as I opened the door. The conference room felt wrong immediately. The lights too harsh, chairs rearranged, no water pitchers. And instead of the full board, just Eliza and Sloane sitting side by side. My wife's arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her wedding ring, the one I'd saved for 2 years to buy, catching the fluorescent light. Sloane was leaning back, the ghost of a smirk playing at the corner of her mouth. "You're fired," Sloane said without preamble, effective immediately. The words hit like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. Time seemed to stop, the fluorescent light suddenly too bright, too loud. "What? On what grounds?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears. "Laziness, delaying contracts." Her voice dropped to a theatrical whisper, "No longer aligned with our future direction." I looked at my wife, my partner, The woman whose hair I'd held back when she was sick, whose tears I'd wiped when her grandmother passed, whose dreams I'd helped build alongside my own. She stared at the empty space in front of her, refusing to meet my eyes, not speaking, not defending, not acknowledging the 4 years we'd shared as husband and wife. In that moment, I didn't just lose my job, I lost my faith in love itself. I realized then that this wasn't an impulsive decision. This was orchestrated, planned, discussed over those sister lunches while I worked nights finishing the Eastern Europe deals. Sloane slid a document across the polished table. Already signed, I didn't need to look at the signature at the bottom to know it was Eliza's, but I did anyway. There it was, the elegant script I'd seen on birthday cards and mortgage papers, the same hand that had written "Forever Yours" in our anniversary card just 2 months ago. I didn't raise my voice, didn't pound the table, didn't plead my case. I understood power games all too well. "I see," I said, my voice steady. "Good luck to both of you." I closed the door quietly behind me. No slam door. No shouting. But in that moment of perfect calm, something dangerous crystallized inside me. A cold, clear purpose that would guide every step that followed. Have you ever felt that moment when betrayal burns away everything except your own resolve? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in our pain helps us find the strength to continue. Walking to the parking garage, my phone buzzed. A text from Frankie. "Just reviewed the Veiltech merger docs from 2020. There's something you need to see, tonight." The suburban colonial, 5 bedrooms, 3-car garage, maple trees lining the driveway, greeted me with suffocating silence. The house stood in Eliza's name, a wedding gift from Douglas. I'd never minded, never questioned it. Trust comes easily until it's shattered. The kitchen island still held her wineglass from last night, a crimson ring staining the bottom, lipstick on the rim, but no Eliza. I sank into the living room sofa, not bothering with lights or television. My fingers hovered over her contact on my phone before I tossed it aside. What would I even say? I remembered how many nights I'd fallen asleep at the kitchen counter, spreadsheets still glowing on my laptop, how Eliza would drape a blanket over my shoulders and press her lips to my forehead. The same woman who'd sat silent as her sister dismantled my career. The same woman whose signature authorized my removal. My chest felt hollow, like someone had carved out everything inside me with a dull spoon. 4 years of marriage. 4 years of building a life together. 4 years of "I love you, and we're in this together." All of it. Lies? Or just conditional, lasting only as long as I was useful to the Harwood dynasty? My phone buzzed again. Frankie's second message of the day. "Do you remember the Veiltech Holdings merger clause from 2020? I didn't. Not clearly. Those were hectic days, expanding operations, integrating systems, trusting the Harwoods implicitly. I'd signed mountains of paperwork, assured by Douglas and Eliza that everything was standard procedure. Check page 17, parallel authority provision. It was never revoked, Frankie added. I went to the home office, unlocked the filing cabinet where I kept important documents. The folder was thick with dust, contracts I'd signed but never had reason to revisit. Veiltech Holdings had been a strategic acquisition, a smaller tech firm with an impressive patent portfolio that HVI had absorbed 5 years ago to bolster their intellectual property arsenal. Page 17 was unremarkable at first glance, filled with dense legal terminology. Then I saw it, buried in subsection C, paragraph 4. Damian Cole shall serve as co-executive chairman of Veiltech Holdings, with independent authority over all intellectual property assets and transactions. And further down, all patents, copyrights, trademarks, and associated intellectual property cannot be transferred, licensed, or otherwise transacted without the express written consent of both executive chairpersons. I read it 3 times to be certain, then understood the magnitude of what had happened. Eliza and Sloane hadn't just fired the wrong person. They'd created a legal catastrophe. Either they didn't know about this clause, or they'd arrogantly overlooked it in their hurry to push me out. They'd forgotten who held the keys to the kingdom. This changed everything. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't just a discarded husband. I was the legal gatekeeper to the most valuable assets HVI possessed. I didn't react impulsively. Didn't call Eliza to gloat. Didn't storm back to the office demanding reinstatement. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water, sat back in my chair, and smiled. Genuinely, for the first time that day. The best revenge requires patience. Another message from Frankie appeared. Without your approval signature, they cannot proceed with any technology contracts, including the Veiltech product line launching next week. Veiltech, HVI's flagship next-generation product. Years of development. Millions in investment. A complete technological ecosystem built entirely on Veiltech patents. The cornerstone of their market strategy for the next 5 years. And legally frozen without my signature. I traced Douglas's bold signature on the contract with my finger. Had he known? Had he intentionally created this failsafe? Or was it simply standard legal language that everyone had forgotten in the rush to consolidate power? The phone rang, breaking my contemplation. The screen displayed a name I hadn't expected to see today. Douglas Harwood. I let it ring twice more, watching the name pulse on the screen before answering. Douglas, I said, keeping my voice neutral, despite the hurricane of emotions beneath. Damien. His voice sounded tired, strained. I just heard what happened. Can we meet? I'm not sure there's anything to discuss, I replied. The contract opened before me like a royal flush in a high-stakes poker game. There was a pause then. I think there's a great deal to discuss, particularly about Veiltech. My heart jumped. He knew. The Riverside Club, private dining room, he continued. 1 hour. Just you and me. I considered refusing, but curiosity won. I'll be there. After hanging up, I photographed the critical pages of the contract and emailed them to myself and to Frankie. Insurance. Then I showered and changed into a fresh suit. Not for Douglas, but for myself. In the bathroom mirror, I straightened my tie and looked myself in the eye. You're not finished, I told my reflection. You're just getting started. The drive to the Riverside Club gave me time to think, to plan, to consider all the angles. Whatever Douglas wanted, whatever he knew or didn't know, I had the upper hand now. The question wasn't whether I would use it, but how. Sometimes betrayal isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the beginning. The morning after my discovery, my phone rang again. Douglas Harwood's name flashed on the screen, earlier than I'd expected. I just heard about your termination, he growled, not bothering with pleasantries. Have they lost their damn minds? It happened, I confirmed, keeping my voice steady, revealing nothing of the legal ammunition I had discovered. A pause then. Did they read the Veiltech merger clause? I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. No, that's precisely why I didn't stop them. The line went quiet for several seconds. I could almost hear the gears turning in Douglas's head, the man who'd built an empire on calculating 10 moves ahead. Keep quiet, he finally said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Let them walk right into it. After hanging up, I spent the morning meticulously building my silent offensive. I printed the entire contract, bound it in a leather portfolio and labeled it in bold red letters. Invalid without Damien Cole's signature. Not that I planned to show it to anyone yet. The power of this document lay in its activation at precisely the right moment. I methodically reviewed every active IP transaction, highlighting each one that would be affected by my veto power. The list grew longer than even I had anticipated. My private notes became a roadmap of leverage. Veiltech, HVI's flagship product scheduled for release next month, 90% dependent on Veiltech technology. The product launch that Sloan had been positioning as her crowning achievement. 4 patent applications pending, all filed under Veiltech Holdings, all requiring my signature for processing. The supply chain agreements with 3 major manufacturing partners, structurally dependent on IP licensing approvals. My approvals. I chose a strategy of absolute silence, paired with comprehensive action. I didn't respond to Eliza's tentative text messages. I ignored 3 emails from Sloan, each progressively less hostile and more urgent. Instead, I maintained contact with only one person inside HVI, Frankie Delgado, who would become my eyes and ears within the company walls. The legal department is in complete meltdown, Frankie reported via our secure messaging channel. Noel Bird can't find any way to invalidate the Veiltech contract. She's been in with Sloan for 4 hours straight. I also quietly retained Riley Chen, a tech IP specialist recommended by a former colleague. She reviewed my position dispassionately. The clause is ironclad, Riley confirmed after reviewing the documents. To modify it would require consent from both executive chairpersons, which means they can't circumvent it through the board or through any corporate restructuring. It's what we call a nuclear provision in merger law. The first domino fell faster than I had anticipated. My phone rang with an unfamiliar number. the CEO of Cobalt Dynamics, a medical device manufacturer that had been licensing our microprocessor technology for their cardiac monitoring systems. "Mr. Cole," he began, his confusion evident, "we haven't received approval for the Veil Shield licensing renewal. Is there a problem we should know about?" I responded with calculated ambiguity. "I no longer hold my previous position. All decisions now rest with the current executive team." "But the approval notification specifically stated it required your signature," he pressed. "I suggest you contact HVI's legal department for clarification," I replied smoothly. By the end of the call, Cobalt had placed their entire order on hold, a $12 million deal suspended in limbo until the internal matter was resolved. Frankie's update came that evening. Noel Bird just got eviscerated in the boardroom. Sloan demanded she find a way to tear up the Veiltech merger agreement. Noel told her it was federally notarized and airtight. 2 hours later, Noel submitted her resignation. The chief legal counsel abandoning ship. Another crack in their foundation. It was time for my counterstrike. From my home office, I composed a carefully worded email using my still active Veiltech Holdings address. The message went to every strategic partner, supplier, and IP licensee in our network. All intellectual property assets related to Veiltech Holdings are currently subject to a temporary transactional freeze under the unmodified merger provisions. Please direct all licensing and patent inquiries to the co-executive chairman of IP until further notice. I signed it with my full title, the one they had forgotten existed but couldn't erase. Carbon copies went to the HVI board of directors and the paralyzed legal department. The response was immediate and devastating. Within hours, Sage Nova, our oldest technology client, sent formal documentation requesting verification of IP ownership rights before proceeding with their quarterly payment. Blue Haven Logistics froze 3 warehouses of components, citing chain of title concerns in the shipping authorization. The internal messaging system at HVI lit up with confused employees questioning who actually controlled the company's most valuable assets. Frankie reported hearing whispers in the break room. "Damien's the one who has the keys to the system. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button." I promise to share more stories about turning life's darkest moments into unexpected victories. Your support means everything to me. I was reviewing the cascade of email responses when my phone vibrated again. An internal company number. A text message, brief and stark, from the last person I expected to hear from. "Please meet me, just once. Eliza." I stared at those 5 words, feeling neither triumph nor anger, just a cold certainty that now the real game was beginning. I chose Madison and Pine for our meeting, the same upscale bistro where Eliza and I had celebrated our 2nd wedding anniversary, a deliberate choice. The memories of champagne toasts and promises of forever would hang in the air between us like ghosts. Eliza arrived precisely on time, her composure visibly strained. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, poorly concealed by makeup. Her Burberry coat was immaculate, her hair perfectly styled. Putting up appearances had always been her specialty. But the slight tremor in her hands as she placed her purse on the chair betrayed her. No embrace, no warmth, just a cautious glance and a quiet, "Thank you for coming." I nodded, saying nothing as the waiter poured water. The silence stretched between us like a tightening wire until she finally broke. "Things have gone too far," she began, her voice softened to that persuasive tone she used for difficult negotiations. "Sloan thought, we didn't know you still held the IP rights." I took a deliberate sip of water, meeting her eyes directly over the rim of the glass. I'd rehearsed this moment, not what I would say, but what I wouldn't. My silence forced her to continue. "You could come back," she offered, leaning forward slightly. "In a different role. We could start over." "Start over?" I finally spoke, my voice perfectly controlled. "After you signed papers dismissing me like a seasonal intern?" Her composure faltered for the first time in our 8-year relationship. Eliza wasn't steering the conversation with practiced charm. She wasn't in control. "I'm not here to beg," I continued. "I'm here to confirm what I already suspected. You're not remorseful. You're just sorry you got caught." The color drained from her face as I laid the truth bare between us. "You say you didn't know, but you signed anyway. Who initiated the termination, Eliza?" Her eyes dropped to the untouched menu before her. Silence. "You sat silent in that meeting," I pressed, my voice low but intense. "You chose silence then. Now you're choosing amnesty?" A tear threatened at the corner of her eye. "Don't you still love me?" The question hung in the air, so nakedly manipulative that I almost laughed. I did, I replied evenly. But love doesn't shield against betrayal with a signature. She flinched as if I'd struck her. We both knew there would be no reconciliation. Not as spouses, not as colleagues. Whatever we'd been to each other had died in that fluorescent-lit conference room. Later that afternoon, Douglas called an emergency board meeting. I wasn't invited, but Frankie kept me informed of every development through a steady stream of texts. Douglas, it seemed, had finally stepped fully back into his role as founder, standing before the anxious board members. He laid out the situation with brutal clarity. We have no options left. Damien controls all our IP, and he's the only one with the capability to salvage HVI. His proposal was straightforward. Reinstate me as executive chairman with control over all intellectual property assets. The conditions sent shockwaves through the room. Sloan would be removed from external affairs and relegated to a secondary research division. Eliza would be demoted to COO, required to report directly to me on a daily basis. The boardroom erupted in heated debate, but the financial reality was inescapable. Without access to Veiltech's intellectual property, HVI was a hollowed shell. Their quarterly projections would collapse. The Veil Next launch would be cancelled. Stock would plummet. By evening, I received a formal invitation to attend the following morning's special session. I arrived precisely at 9 a.m., impeccably dressed, expression neutral. Sloane's glare burned into me from across the table, while Eliza kept her eyes fixed on her folded hands. Douglas stood, commanding the room's attention. "We need you, Damien. The board has voted." The results flashed on the screen. 8 votes in favor, 2 against. A decisive mandate. Sloane's chair scraped against the floor as she stormed out, slamming the heavy door behind her. Eliza remained, shoulders hunched, a portrait of defeat. The room waited for my response, perhaps expecting gratitude, perhaps expecting triumph. They received neither. "I'm not returning to forgive," I stated, my voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I'm returning to fix mistakes. Mistakes I didn't make." Douglas crossed to where I stood, placing a weathered hand on my shoulder. "You won't be doing it alone. I stand with you." The message was clear to everyone present. The dynasty had a new heir. Not by blood, but by merit and necessity. As the meeting adjourned, and I walked toward the elevator, Harper Lynn, the brilliant head of brand strategy, fell into step beside me. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "If you're rebuilding HVI, I'm with you." I glanced at her, seeing not opportunism, but genuine resolve in her eyes. Harper had always been one of the few who measured contribution by results, rather than family connections. "Why?" I asked simply. "Because this company's rotting from the inside," she replied, eyes flicking toward the boardroom we'd left behind. "And you're the only one willing to cut out the decay." The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, holding them with one hand. Monday. My office, 8 a.m. She nodded once, a silent pact formed as the doors closed. I allowed myself the first genuine smile since this all began. My return wasn't just about revenge, it was about reconstruction. The Harwood sisters had tried to erase me from the company's future. Instead, they'd handed me the blueprints to rebuild it entirely. Sometimes, the most devastating response to betrayal isn't outrage. It's methodical, coldly calculated resurrection. My new office overlooked the sprawling cityscape from the top floor of the HVI tower, a corner suite previously reserved for Douglas himself. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but then again, I wasn't aiming for subtlety anymore. The first visible sign of the power shift appeared within 48 hours, a modest plaque beneath the refreshed Veiltech logo outside the main conference room, reading, "Under the executive chairmanship of D. Cole." Not my idea, but I didn't veto it either. Let them see the name they'd tried to erase now prominently displayed. My first executive action targeted the internal approval systems. Every new product proposal would now route through the IP division first. My division. Financial reporting would split into separate streams for Veiltech and HVI proper, creating unprecedented transparency about where the real value resided. And Eliza, once my equal partner in life, would now sit through weekly progress meetings where she could speak only when directly addressed. Some might call it petty. I called it structural realignment. You know what's ironic? Frankie said, leaning against the doorframe of my office one evening. They fired the only person who actually understood how the company works. I picked up my phone and called him directly, though he stood just 6 feet away. Puzzled, he answered. Frankie Delgado, I said formally. I'd like to offer you the position of Chief Financial Officer, effective immediately. His eyes widened as he lowered the phone. Are you serious? When someone stands by integrity at the cost of their own safety, they deserve more than gratitude, I replied. They deserve power to enforce that integrity. He accepted on the spot. Next came Harper Lynn. Her text that day after the board meeting, "If you're rebuilding HVI, I'm with you," had revealed where her loyalties lay. Deputy Director of Brand Strategy and Repositioning, I offered when we met. Complete creative autonomy to redefine who we are. Harper smiled for the first time in months. God, I've been dying to tear down those awful Harwood family portraits in the lobby. Start there, I said. Replace them with the actual engineers who built this place. One by one, I assembled a core team based on merit, not bloodlines. People whose contributions had been overshadowed by the glittering Harwood name were suddenly visible, valued, empowered. Frankie and I spent a full weekend reviewing every senior staff position, highlighting names that appeared through nepotism rather than qualification. We found the VP of Client Relations was none other than Sloan's roommate from Harvard. The sustainability director turned out to be the son of Douglas's longtime golf buddy. Then there were the 3 strategic advisors whose contributions remained mysteriously undocumented despite their generous salaries and prominent titles. We implemented a new hiring policy, first-round resume reviews with all names and personal identifiers removed, advancement based solely on measurable contribution. The marketing department purged all Harwood family imagery from company materials. No more glossy photos of Douglas and his daughters posing in front of buildings they hadn't designed. Instead, spotlight features on the engineering teams, the actual architects of HVI's success. My most meticulous attention, however, went to surgically dismantling Eliza and Sloan's remaining influence. Eliza's mornings now began with 8 a.m. direct reports to me. Every vague statement was interrupted with, "Specific numbers, please." Every attempt at charm cut short. In meetings, I directed questions past her to her subordinates. Within 3 weeks, executives stopped making eye contact with her during presentations. She had become a ghost, present but irrelevant. Sloan fared no better. Transferred to a research division with no budgetary authority and no decision-making power, she spent the first week fuming in visible silence. On day 8, she submitted a formal request for unpaid leave due to mental health concerns. I approved it within the hour, simultaneously revoking her system access for security during absence. Her badge would no longer open the main doors. 3 weeks into my restructuring, I introduced the Coal Reform Clause to the board, a comprehensive governance overhaul. No intellectual property rights may be transferred, licensed, or otherwise encumbered without review by an independent authorization council. And the provision that made Douglas's eyebrows rise. Fair succession protocol. All candidates for management positions, including descendants of founding members, must undergo identical 3-phase assessment as external candidates. The vote. Unanimous approval, even from board members who had previously leaned toward Eliza's camp. I wasn't just winning, I was changing the rules of the game. The next morning, a handwritten note arrived from Douglas. "I should have done this years ago. Thank you for saving what I built from those who would have inherited it." Results began materializing faster than even I had anticipated. Frankie's quarterly projections showed a 14% revenue increase. Employee resignation rates dropped by 60%. Harper unveiled a bold new brand identity, HVI, built by minds, not bloodlines. Strategic partners who had frozen their relationships during the power struggle returned to the fold. Cobalt Dynamics signed a 5-year extension. Sage Nova doubled their order. Blue Haven Logistics resumed shipments with enthusiastic apologies. Perhaps most telling was the spontaneous wall of code that appeared in the engineering department, a collection of photos showcasing employees who had rescued troubled projects from failure. My picture had been pinned at the top, labeled simply, "The man who owned everything." I was reviewing the day's final emails when a message from Tom Reyes, a veteran board member with deep connections in the investment community, appeared in my inbox. Confidential. Rumors circulating among venture capitalists that Sloan is quietly forming her own tech company based on stolen Veiltech intellectual property. Call me. I leaned back in my chair, phone already in hand. This wasn't just a minor breach, this was industrial espionage. And unlike the bloodless coup that had removed me, this had clear legal consequences. Some might have felt anger. I felt only cold certainty. Sloane had given me the perfect opportunity to finish what her betrayal had started. Sometimes, the most complete revenge isn't destroying your enemy, it's letting them destroy themselves. I didn't rush when it came to Sloane. Revenge executed in haste leaves fingerprints. I hired Blackwell and Faraday, an independent legal firm specializing in intellectual property theft, to investigate her activities with absolute discretion. No connection to HVI. No paper trail leading back to me. Take your time, I instructed their lead investigator. Be thorough. Leave nothing to chance. 3 weeks later, their report arrived via secure courier, sealed, unmarked, and devastatingly complete. Sloane had partnered with Marcus Reeves, a former HVI developer who'd been terminated 4 months earlier for performance issues. In reality, he'd been one of Sloane's most vocal supporters. Together, they'd been approaching venture capital firms with technical specifications nearly identical to Veiltech's proprietary systems. The smoking gun, a pitch deck containing code snippets that matched our protected algorithms line for line. Not adapted, not inspired by, copied verbatim. I reviewed the evidence twice, then forwarded the entire package to the Federal Intellectual Property Protection Commission. I added one note: activate criminal prosecution clauses. This wasn't about corporate competition anymore, this was theft, plain and simple. The legal machinery moved with surprising efficiency. By month's end, federal marshals delivered an asset freeze order on Sloane Harwood's personal accounts. Every investment deal she'd been cultivating collapsed overnight, her hastily assembled team scattered like roaches when the lights come on. The financial press had a field day. Former HVI co-executive embroiled in IP theft scandal, whistleblower Damian Cole. Unlike Sloane, I declined all interview requests. No television appearances. No quotes for newspapers. Just a single press statement. The law applies equally to everyone, whether they once shared your bed or your bloodline. I wasn't interested in public vindication. The legal record would speak for itself. 3 days after the news broke, my phone rang. Eliza, for the first time since our meeting at Madison and Pine. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and shame. "Let me step away." The request wasn't surprising. With her sister's reputation in tatters and her own authority reduced to a formality, Eliza had become a ghost haunting her own life. "Your freedom is no longer my concern," I replied evenly. The next morning, her resignation email appeared in the company-wide announcement system. No explanation. No farewell message, just formal notification of her departure, effective immediately. The Harwood sisters, both architects of my removal, had now removed themselves. Douglas called me to his home that weekend. He looked older than I remembered, the events of recent months having carved new lines into his face. "I'm transferring full operational control of Veiltech to you," he said, sliding a document across his desk. "No co-chairs, no shared authority. You've earned the right to run it as you see fit." With his signature, Veiltech officially became a subsidiary with me as CEO and chairman, completely separate from the Harwood family line for the first time in its history. In my first address to the Veiltech team, I unveiled our new company ethos. Technology doesn't need dynasties, only ethics and competence. The applause wasn't polite or obligatory, it was genuine relief. 6 months after my firing, I walked through the headquarters with a sense of quiet satisfaction. Employees nodded with respect as I passed, not from fear of authority, but from earned recognition. The company was thriving, projects launched on schedule. The stock had recovered and then soared. Harper walked past, leading a group of bright-eyed interns. She paused, gesturing toward me. "That's the man who saved this company, without ever having to threaten or shout at anyone." The interns looked impressed, but more importantly, they looked inspired. That was the legacy I wanted, not fear, not dominance, but a demonstration of principled resilience. In my office that evening, I placed the original Veiltech merger contract into the safe, the document that had transformed betrayal into opportunity. Beside it, I placed a framed copy of the Coal Reform Clause. Douglas had once told me I had business in my blood. He'd been right, but not in the way he meant. What I had wasn't hereditary privilege or family connections. It was something more valuable. the ability to turn a calculated dismissal into a complete reinvention. As I looked out over the city lights that evening, I reflected on what true revenge actually means, not the momentary satisfaction of watching enemies fall, but the lasting power of rising far beyond their ability to reach you. The Harwood sisters hadn't just lost their positions, they'd lost their relevance. They were footnotes in a story that had outgrown them. I don't need them to collapse, I said to the empty room. I just need them to know that every time they step into this world, they're walking on the foundation I built from their betrayal. If my story touched something in you today, please hit that subscribe button. Everyone faces betrayal at some point, but not everyone finds the strength to transform it into triumph. Share your own stories of resilience in the comments below. Remember, sometimes life's greatest setbacks become our most powerful opportunities for growth. Sometimes, the most complete victory isn't measured in what you take from others, but in what you build for yourself.